Thank you very much, Sam, for that introduction, and thank you also to the West Australian Apartment Advocacy Group for the invitation to speak. My presentation today, if we can just get it up on the screen, deals with future housing trends and how they are being shaped by demographic change in Perth and across Australia, with particular emphasis on the impact on the apartment market. So underpinning all of this demand is in fact demographics, and I want to take you through that story this morning. I want to start, however, by asking a big picture question. Why should you have faith in the future of Australia? Why should you invest your energy, your capital, your life, your career in the future of a project in Western Australia, in Australia over the next 5 years? And I want to convince you of that you should with this chart. What I show in this chart is the 15 largest economies on Earth. This is ranked by gross domestic product in US dollars. The data is produced by the International Monetary Fund. It's released every April. And yes, I do hang out for these figures. And your eye will go immediately to the bottom left corner. In fact, where Australia is ranked, we are the 13th largest economic force on the planet. We are just below number 14, which is Spain. We've actually overtaken Spain over the last 12 months or so. Spain has had a bad pandemic, and we're not too far behind Brazil. Brazil has 6 times the population of Australia, but it lost a quarter of its economy last year, in fact. My big observation here is not the amount of gross domestic product that Australia generates or our rate of growth. My big observation here is that there is no country ranked above Australia on this list that has a lesser population. We are really rich per capita. And it raises a quite legitimate question. Well, if the Australians are so rich, as evidenced by this chart, well then where do we spend our wealth? We don't spend it disproportionately on defence, for example. And I say that we spend our wealth on housing, on quality of life, maybe on infrastructure, the type of product, in fact, that is delivered through the accommodation industry throughout Australia. So there is a fundamental allegiance by the Australian people to housing. That's where our wealth goes, in fact. Let's take this further and look at why Western Australia. And in order to do this, I want to show you the net migration to and from the state of Western Australia for 30 years or so, from 1980 through to 2021 on the right. And this shows the net migration from overseas and from interstate. And what I take from this is that generally around about 19,000 people were added to the West Australian population every year from interstate and overseas immigration. And when you look at what has happened over the last 12 months or so, you can see that red bar on the right. There's been a small net outflow. When you look at this map or this chart for Victoria, the bar goes deep down. The same thing applies to Sydney, to New South Wales. What I take from this is that Western Australia is actually extraordinarily self-contained, that it doesn't necessarily rely on the inflow of students and of immigrants the way in which the East Coast does. It's more of its own entity, if you like. It sets its own agenda. It doesn't mean that you don't need skilled immigrants in certain areas, but I think the reliance is less than it is on the eastern seaboard, and particularly with regard to students. But of course, when you look at this, you can say, well, this has been a major driver of the population growth and of the prosperity of Perth and of Western Australia over the last 30 or 40 years or so. Let's just see before we come back to Perth, let's have a look at what the West Australians have done with the state of Western Australia literally in the 21st century, between the year 2000 and 2020, the first 20 years of the 21st century. West Australians have added roughly 1 million people to their population base. And you can see where they've been added in those blue bits across the state of Western Australia. Of course, a lot up in the Pilbara, up in the Kimberley, off a low base, of course. But largely, it is focused on the cities, the lifestyle cities up the coast and down the coast in the southwest part of the state. So 1 million people being added to a relatively small population base over the first 20 years of the 21st century, you would say, well, the kind of business that you need to be in Western Australia at that time in history would be building, construction, infrastructure, housing, and maybe even apartments when you think about it. It's a mega trend driver of the demand for the business that you are in, is the bottom line. But the other observation I take from this map, and I think this is true from Australia as a whole, you can see that in the inset in the top right, is that Australians are obsessed with the coast, up the coast, down the coast, big city lifestyle, and you need housing that aligns or that delivers that quality of life in those areas. So, suburban housing and apartments, you would think. Let's take this further and have a look at the centre of Perth and benchmark it with the centre of Sydney. You can see Sydney on the right, you can see Perth on the left. And I've just taken a 5-kilometre radius around the GPO, centred on the GPO for Sydney and for Perth. And you can see that within about 5 kilometres of the centre of Perth, there's about 160,000 people resident within that geography. Whereas when you go to Sydney, it's closer to, in fact, almost 500,000 people, 460,000 people. The equivalent figure for Melbourne is around about 350,000. The equivalent figure for Brisbane is about 280,000. When you look at this, you can see, well, actually, Perth is relatively thinly populated in the inner suburbs. It's certainly not to the same extent that you get in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And in my view, what this means is that there is a different preference, a different lifestyle in the West. Does not mean that West Australians and Perth residents aren't inclined to apartment living, but they'll do it their way, with their values and in a unique kind of way. And I think that's a very West Australian trait in a range of things. So does not mean that there is no market for it, just means that it must be done in a unique and nuanced West Australian way, in fact. And you can actually see the difference between the demography of the apartment market compared to the suburban market in the West in this map. I've simply identified in this map of Western Australia, of Perth, those areas where there is a high concentration, more than 40%, I think the figure is, or 20%, of houses or accommodation in those light yellow bits, of course, dominated by apartments. And of course, you've got the CBD, you've got the area around Burswood, you've got the area around Subiaco, of course, and then just extending right out to Cottesloe and then down to Fremantle and even down to, I think that's North Coogee there. So if you put all those, this is the heartland, this is the core, if you like. This is what I mean about West Australians, and Perth just does it differently. You go to Melbourne, you go to Sydney, there's apartments everywhere. And of course there are apartments everywhere in Perth, but there are some precincts where this lifestyle really comes into its own in Western Australia. And when you look at this, the common denominator here is that West Australians will choose apartment living if it is near a university, so Murdoch, of course, and then University of Western Australia, which is important. It needs to be close to the CBD, within reasonable proximity to the CBD, close to, in fact, the cool, hip strips of Subiaco and Claremont and so forth. And also it must offer water access, water views, water proximity, whether it's on the beach or whether it's the Swan River. That is my big takeout here. This is about Western Australians being unique, being focused on their quality of life and having apartments fit in to their way of life. I know many years ago when I was talking about the sea change shift and the tree change shift, and on the eastern seaboard you had Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane indulging in sea change and tree change. But in Western Australia, there wasn't a strong tree change movement. But you go to Perth and people go 3 hours up the coast and 3 hours down the coast. It's in other words, what West Australians, to me, seem to do is say, yeah, I see what's happening in the east, the sea change, tree change thing. We love sea change, and we'll go up and down the coast. We're not so focused on tree change. In other words, West Australians will take a reference point from the east coast and then put it through a sieve, a mincer if you like, and do it their way. is the way I'm interpreting that. So you can actually see the apartment heartland for Perth following the watercourses of that city, and of course the key infrastructure like the CBD and the universities. Let's have a look at the demography of those yellow bits, the apartment spaces and the suburban spaces. And you can do this from the census, and you can see two worlds. So you have one city, Perth, but there are two markets, two demographies when you look at this. Even in things like the number of registered motor vehicles, this is captured from the census, of course, and apartments are less likely to have motor vehicles, of course, parked in them, as is suburbia. So motor cars belong in suburbia. I suppose bicycles or walking or scooters these days belong in apartment living. And that is the point of apartments, is that they need to be or can be quite in close proximity to key workplaces or lifestyle destinations. And the same thing applies on that bar chart on the right with regard to home tenure. Renters are more likely to seek out an apartment, whereas home buyers will more likely live in Australian suburbia when you think about it. So these markets have very different tastes and preferences. We can take this further and look at workforce skill level. And skill level 1 is the highest level of skills in the workforce, usually with university degree education. And you can see that that skill level is very much focused on the apartment geography, whereas the lower skilled, even no skilled workers prefer suburbia. So you can see the market separating to one city, two geographies, two markets, two ways of living, done in a unique Perth kind of way, is the argument. And you can even go down to something as left field as religious affiliation, and you see more traditional values, that is high levels of religious affiliation in suburbia, whereas more progressive thinking, you would say, sort of non-religious people, perhaps preferring the apartment kind of lifestyle. But again, my point here is there is a different market. You need to actually be quite finely tuned and targeted in your marketing to the apartment market. It's not as open slather, if you like, as it is in when you're selling suburban residential property, in fact. And you can actually see this, the difference between Perth and other capital cities in this table. Again, you can only get this data from the census. We have a new census with results due in November of next year. In fact, but these things don't bounce around too much. They rise and fall off an established base. And what this shows is that 82% of dwellings in Western Australia, in Perth, in 2016 were separate houses on separate blocks of land. And that 82% compares with a 63% in Sydney, and just 5% of dwellings in Perth in 2016 were of the apartment product, whereas in Sydney it's 23%. And so what I'm expecting in November of next year, the 2021 figures, it won't be 5%, it might be 9 or 10%. I think there'll be quite a step up over the last 5 years or so, as West Australians effectively cherry-pick the best bits of East Coast living and develop it in their own style in Western Australia. And in Perth. Let's have a look at the way in which the life cycle has changed over time. There is a sense that the way we're living is changing, and you can see that not just the way we're living, but even the life cycle is changing over time. If you go back 80 years to look at life expectancy in Australia in 1941, the average Australian at that time lived for 63 years. You qualified for the age pension at 65, so you promptly dropped dead 2 years before you got the pension back in 1941. There were no teenagers in 1941. You're a child for 14 years, then you're an adult, and you're an old person at 51 or 52. If you were 50 years old and unhappy in your relationship in 1941, you'd think, well, what's the point? I'm going to be dead in 10 years' time. I might just wait this out. So, that was our parents' or grandparents' thinking when you think about it. 40 years later, life expectancy has kicked out for the average Australian from 63 to 74. That gives you, in fact, 9 years in retirement. So these changes to the life cycle demand and prompt different accommodations or different ways of living. You can see that by 1981, the teenager has made their appearance. This is an invention of the baby boom generation, of course, and you're now not old until well into your 60s. You have permission to be old in your 60s back in 1981. Kick it forward 40 years to 2021, and it's a different story altogether. Life expectancy for the average Australian is 84 years, although the average time for retirement for an Australian is more likely to be around about 58 years. So what is that? That is 26 years in retirement. What are you going to do? Sit at home and babysit the grandkids for 26 years? Baby boomers in retirement will not do that. They will not sit quietly and go off into the night of retirement in suburbia. They'll reinvent that space. They will work on. They will demand a different quality of life, or at least a sufficient quantity will actually want that inner city lifestyle, is what I am suggesting. And if you look at other parts of the life cycle, that teenage phase of life that was invented by the baby boomers between 13 and 19 has been stretched, I think, by the millennials, postponement, commitment to marriage, mortgage, children, a career until the late 20s. And the time that you're an adult is collapsing between 30 and about 55 or so, and we're seeing the emergence of a lifestyle stage of the life cycle. You're not retired, you're not working full-time, you want this sort of convenience of lock and leave, you might be doing some travelling. You want an accommodation arrangement that better suits your lifestyle and your aspirations, in fact. And that is what I mean about the Australian apartment and housing market needs to respond to the demographic driver being the household and the way in which people live, their prosperity and their expectations in life. And so when I look at that top bar, I can see opportunities in the adolescence stage in the life cycle where people want to live independently of mum and dad. So that would be the whole student market, if you like, in their 20s and early 30s. And then, of course, you have the young couples in their 20s and 30s, maybe with even one child or something like that, could be another market for the apartment. And then, of course, you have the corporates and so forth and the cosmopolitans who want to stay connected to the city, and then the retirees who want that safety, that security, that ease of lock and leave to actually get on with their life. The point is that this is very fluid, very changeable and very adaptable, and the market needs to respond to that. Let's have a look at some of the segments that I think apply to the apartment market in Western Australia. And of course, I've made these up. I've called them age 25 to 38, under the age of 25, people these days kind of living with mum and dad or, maybe in a share house or something like that. But from 25 when they enter the workforce right through to about 38 or so, I think that this is the hipster in the city stage in the life cycle. So they might be in share houses, they might be living singly, they might be partnered up, they might even have one child. In fact, towards the mid 30s. In fact, they're predominantly renters and singles, couples, and share houses. I think dominate that. And what I've shown on the right is the number of people added to this key demographic over 100 years in Western Australia, or at least 80 years. It goes back to about 1986 or so and projected out to 2056. And you can see where we are in 2021 and the number of people pushing into this stage in the life cycle in Western Australia, you can see rising. So if you were investing in property or developing property or buying property at this time, then logic suggests that there's going to be more people competing for that kind of property in the coming decade or so, because there's a demographic tailwind behind this segment of the market in this geography at this time in history. Think, oh, well, that's 25 to 38. What about the 38 to 54? This is typically when some sell up in the inner city and they go to suburbia, to a McMansion. You know, some may well do that. But I'm suggesting that, in fact, there is going to be another segment of the market, sort of, you know, people who are connected into corporate life in St George's Terrace or wherever it is in Perth, and they simply will not go to suburbia. And they might have 1 or 2 children. So you've got lifestyle-driven corporates with kids wanting that apartment. Water views, water access, city access, ease of coming and going. And when you look at the numbers again, you can see on the right that the numbers in the immediate future, 5, 10, 15, even 20 years into the future, is rising. This is the thing I love about Western Australia. There's just growth and opportunity everywhere, in every segment that you look at. Because of the high level of the birth rate, exceeding the death rate, of course, and interstate and overseas migration when the borders open up. Let's take this further. So we're up to the age of 54 with the lifestyle corporates. You then move into a phase of pre-retirees. So you're starting to downshift, downsize, scale back. You might only be working 3 days a week or 4 days a week, something like that. And you want better control over your lifestyle. So these are people late 50s, early 60s or so, and they want lock and leave convenience. They want that very sophisticated, almost Manhattan-esque kind of lifestyle. And it's only truly an apartment that can deliver that in a maintenance-free type of environment. And when you look at the next 10 years, yes, there's still growth, perhaps not as significant growth as you see in some of the other segments, but if you were to compare this market with other cities, for example, you say, well, actually, growth at this time in the life cycle, this is really post-baby boomers, Generation X, so that's still got growth in this market going forward. And then, of course, you come to the active retirees market. I've called them the groovy grandparents. I don't even know if groovy is still a word these days, 65 to 79, in fact, and this is dominated by the baby boomers, and their main focus is to lock and leave. They want safety, they want security, and they also want drop-in convenience. They need to have their apartment in what I would call a drop-in zone. So you can't be on the edge of town. You need to be, between the university, doing the CBD, between the beaches and so forth. You want your grandkids to be coming and going and so forth. You want to be at the centre of activity is the argument. So this is the baby boomer generation. You can see their numbers on the right. This is the 60 to 79 demographic, and you can see we're almost at the peak of this demographic in Western Australia and in 2021. Still very strong growth for another 5, 10, even 20 years or so into the future. And then, of course, you have what I think is a new market segment that we'll see much more of over the next decade or so, and it's the elderly and loving it. These are people over the age of 80. And yes, there are people who are challenged with mobility and health issues and so forth. But I think there's going to be another group, particularly driven by the baby boomers moving into that stage of the life cycle. These are people that stopped smoking, 20 or 30 years or so ago, eating salads, walking, being very focused on keeping fit, keeping well. And so there is a lifestyle extraction of quality of life that you can get, I think, in your early to mid 80s in this stage in the life cycle. If you need health services and facilities, you order them in-home services and facilities. And again, being close to that drop-in zone for children and grandchildren, I think is quite important. It also gives safety and security and community to this generation at this stage in the life cycle. I suppose what I'm getting at here is that at every stage of the adult life cycle, there is a market, I think, a rising market in Western Australia and in Perth for apartment product. And that's not going to suit everyone. The main form of housing across Australia remains suburbia. Darryl Kerrigan has still got that model right, I would say. But what we're actually seeing is targeted, nuanced, articulated housing solutions marketed with rifle shot accuracy into a particular demographic with all the right services that you would expect in that particular area. Let's just change focuses to some extent at the moment, and I want to take you to Again, why you should have faith in the immediate future. I love this chart because it tracks confidence in the Australian economy, and it shows quarter by quarter GDP growth and contraction from 1971 on the left through to the June quarter of 2021 on the right. And your eye will go immediately to that red bar on the right. What that says is that in June of last year, when there was the national lockdown, the Australian economy contracted by 7 percentage points compared to the March quarter. But then if you look at what has happened in the 4 quarters since, in September, in December, in March and June, over the last 12 months, the Australians have rocketed out of this. It's almost as if the Australian mindset is, yes, we want to put that pain, that recession, because it technically was, we want to put that behind us, and we want to rebuild, recreate, procreate, maybe even a baby boom, and rebuild a better version of Australia. And what better way to rebuild a better version of Australia than to rethink where you're located, the kind of housing that you need. People are often talking about the Great Resignation, that we're going to see a lot of people resign because they've spent 2 years contemplating the job that they're in, and then they're deciding, actually, I don't want to be in this job, I want to be in another job. I suspect there's going to be a lot of reorganisation. You might also see people saying, I want to rearrange where I live or how I live. I don't want to be maintaining a garden. I want to reimagine where and how I live and get the model right for the kind of lifestyle I want to lead in the 2020s. And of course, that's where the apartment option comes into its own. People making quite radical shift. I see the pandemic as an inflection point in Australia. I think we'll see different values, different consumer behaviour on the other side of the pandemic. And when you think about that, I think that apartments are certainly part of that story. Not for everyone, but you only need a small shift in a market like the West Australian apartment market and can have a big impact because it's off a relatively small base. The other thing about this is when you look back through time, you can see, well, we have not had a recession on the Australian continent since 1991. What's that, 29 years or so? And my argument is that that has created a culture of expectation. If every year has been better than the last for 29 or 30 years, then that would impact customer experience and customer expectations. We might have been happy to go on a caravan holiday to the Geraldton Caravan Park back in the 1990s. Today we want a Jetstar holiday to Bali. We have upped the ante in how we expect to live because we have had 30 years of unbroken prosperity. The last time the Australian continent put together 30 years of unbroken prosperity was 1860 to 1890. It's been 100 years. You have just lived through a 100-year boom, in fact, in terms of prosperity. And it raises the bar in terms of how people expect to live, and you can see that evidenced in their homes. Let's just step through that. Here is the kind of house that applied to Middle Australia back in the 1950s, the kind of house that Edna Everage probably parodied at that time. It was a quarter-acre block. It's 1,000 square metres, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, mum and dad, 4 kids or more. Dad works, mum's a housewife, and bunk beds for the kids in the bedroom. It's kind of house I was brought up in, not the house I was brought up in, but very similar, in fact. So if you were to visit this house back in the 1950s, you'd go up the pathway onto the porch, and then you'd turn right into the lounge room. The lounge room was the good room. There was only one good room back in the 1950s. The good room was where you entertained guests and suitors. Suitors never got near a bedroom back in the 1950s. Very different today, I can tell you. And then off to the side is a mahogany side stand with a silver tea service. And the purpose of that was to showcase the wealth, the prosperity and the values of the couple that ran that household. If you fast forward to today, 70 years, to the middle of a pandemic, here is how we live today. Here is how I think you might live today. If you were to choose a house, I'll get onto an apartment in just a moment, here is how you would live if you were to live in a house. is not 1,000 square metres, only 500 square metres. But it is 4 bedrooms, not 3 bedrooms. It's 2 bathrooms, not 1 bathroom. It's 2 income earners, not 1 income earner. And it's 2 kids, not 4 kids. If you were to visit this house today, your house, you would be taken down through the house. The good room is not at the front of the house. The good room is at the back of the house. And the purpose of it's a bit like putting the milk at the back of the supermarket aisles. They want to drag you right through. We want to drag you right through the house to showcase your wealth and prosperity, because housing, wealth and prosperity and how we live is absolutely critical to Australian values. Not just Australian, but also new immigrant Australians as well. And if you're coming from India or China or whatever it is, you want to showcase how well you have prospered in the new world. It has it's a great alignment of values. So you take your guests through the house, past the open doors to the bedrooms, which means the bedrooms now need to be glimpse perfect. And this has led to the pillowification of the bedroom over the last 20 years or so. Not 2 pillows, not 4 pillows, but 6 pillows. And then you have a little square pillow set to diamond effect right in the middle of it. And it's important that it be exactly right. If you are living in a house where you have the pillow thing happening, just sneak into the bedroom, just square up the pillows, and then see what happens later in the day, in fact. And men can never get the pillow architecture right. You grab the pillow by its ears, you fluff it up, you drop it into position, then karate chop in the middle to give this perfect V. This is as important to us today as was the silver tea service a generation ago. We are very prescriptive about this. Then you take your guests through to the kitchen family room, and you mill around an island bench, which means the island bench moves up mark. It's now marble, Calcutta marble in waterfall style. Rising out of the centre of it will be a silver German gooseneck tap. Tapware is now the new silverware, in fact. And then off to the side is what we call a butler's pantry. So you have a show kitchen at the front, which is just for show, but you do the real cooking behind a closed door. You can have butler's kids. You have the real kids out the back, but you have the butler's kids out the front. And I think there's another step here. Could you have a butler's pantry off the butler's pantry to showcase that even your butler's pantry is kept perfectly? And then off to the side is what we used to call a back veranda back in the 1950s. Then it was called a terrace. Today it goes by the single pop star name, a bit like Beyonce or Madonna. It's called al fresco. And you can see this sort of Mediterranean indoor-outdoor living that Australians have absorbed. Now, we're living in an Anglo-English house up to the 1950s and 1960s. In come the Greeks and the Italians and say, what the hell are those Australians doing living in an English house? They have a Mediterranean climate, especially in Perth, even in Melbourne. They should have indoor-outdoor living. And the Australians, the most plastic, pliable, absorbent, tolerant people on earth, who are obsessed with lifestyle and housing and variations, you're right. And all of a sudden, from the 1980s onwards, we changed the way we lived. Then along comes a pandemic and everyone's working from home. Up to 50% of Melbourne and Canberra were in fact working from home. You know, you can be sending an email from your laptop on the kitchen table if you're only doing it every now and then. But if you're going to be working from home as a permanent arrangement, even in a hybrid arrangement, then you need to actually have a dedicated workspace. So the 4th bedroom gets made over to a home office. I heard a real estate agent refer to the home office as a Zoom room about 12 months ago. I loved that term so much, I've nicked it. So I'm promoting the Zoom room. Daryl Kerrigan had a pool room, which is his good room. We have the Zoom room, and you have everything perfect in the Zoom room, in fact. And of course, if one person is not commuting, you can sell one of the cars, and the garage can then be used as a home gym, or more likely a storage facility. Or it's more likely a storage facility anyway, in fact. So this is how the home, but so you work from home, you study from home, you shop from home, you do telehealth from home. We're almost cocooning. The home is becoming even more important. If you are increasing the dwell time in the family home, then the home can legitimately take a greater share of wallet. When you think it, you rationalise it in your own mind, in fact. And you can say, look, we didn't go to Bali in 2020, 2021. We can spend that money on home furnishings, home furniture, home technology, home appliances, and investing in our Zoom room. Or, in fact, because I've contemplated life over the last 2 years, I am sick of suburbia. This no longer does it for me. I want to make a complete shift altogether from suburbia to apartmentia, in fact. So what does this look like in a modern apartment? I actually spoke with Sam prior to the conference and asked her to send me a floor plan of a current Perth apartment. And she sent me this one. This is by the Parcel Property Group. It's in Mossman Park. I think this one is called Noma, which I think is north-facing Mossman, I would imagine. It's about level 5. I don't know, it's about 146 something square metres or so. And you can see where you come in and then you turn right. And of course you can glimpse the pillow thing as you pass off to the right. I love the way, and you see this done more and more these days, where you have a screen behind the bed, and that's where the walk-in robe is and the bathroom. I love this because it's a bit like a butler's pantry, isn't it? So you have this official curated view to the public, but real living is done behind the screen, just as real cooking is done in the butler's pantry. In fact, you could say that maybe the house of the future is actually 2 houses. It's a bit like the Instagram curated image you want to project to your visitors as they come down the house, the hallway, look at the pillows and go to the family room. They don't see the mess in your walk-in robe or the mess in the kitchen in the butler's pantry. And you're actually curating a public and private areas to the home. The only thing I would suggest about this space is that they've just called the outdoor space a balcony. It needs to be called al fresco, apparently, I think. But terrific effort by Parcel Properties. I love that, and I'd love to see it. I don't know whether it's up or not. I'm sure Sam will tell me about it. But yes, so what seems to be happening here is that apartment design is taking the very best out of modern homes in suburbia and curating them into these places in the inner city or middle suburbs or lifestyle suburbs with water access, water views, university access and CBD access and views as well. That, to me, is what is unique about the apartment offer in Perth. Very, very rifle shot precision about where your product is and what is included. It's a bit like you're saying, you know what, we've seen what's happening in the east. Yep, very, very interesting. We think we can improve upon it. We don't want this, we don't want that, we don't want this, but we want it to be like that. And this is a great example of exactly taking the very best and presenting the very best to the Perth market. In fact, let's look at how this has impacted the way we live and impacted cities as well. I've always thought of Perth, as well as Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, when I think about it, as being a bit like a fried egg. All my analogies seem to have food themes like eggs and avocados and goat's cheese curtain or whatever. But when you think of Perth, it is a bit like a fried egg. So you have the rich creamy yolk, where you have the CBD and all the cool jobs and the hip strips and so forth, right through to Subiaco, and maybe you can stretch that out a little bit to Cottesloe, I would imagine. And then you have the broad, flat white of suburbia. And the idea is that you live on the edge of Perth and you commute into the city centre and then back out again, and you do that 5 days a week for a 30-year career. Do you really think that the millennial generation are going to do that in the post-COVID? They'll say, I ain't doing that. It's fine for my baby boomer parents to do it. I will not do that. And the reason why I will not do that is because I can see a better way. This is the idea of working from home or having some sort of hybrid arrangement, or in fact a hybrid arrangement from an apartment in an inner or middle suburbs. This is the idea that we're suddenly released from the prescriptivism of suburban life in Australia by the pandemic. This has been a Control-Alt-Delete moment, and now we're thinking boldly about how we want to organise our lives, our accommodation, our employment, even our cities. So I'm saying out with the fried egg, in with the 20-minute city. Town planners have been banging on about this for 20 years. They've nicked the idea from the Paris Strategic Plan about 20 years ago. This is the idea that you live, work, play, recreate, go to university, go to hospital, go on a bike path, go to a local cafe, all within your local area. It reduces carbon emissions, it's kinder to mental health, and it strengthens local communities. And when you think about this, you know, that scrambled egg type model on the right could well be Greater Metropolitan Perth, and then some of the suburban hubs would therefore also have apartments around it. I was actually in Joondalup in May of this year and very impressed with some of the apartment offer and, you know, some of the suburban housing up there as well. But again, you can see that very much fitting into the model of Perth and Western Australia. You'll see the dashed line out to what is called a Vespa Town. This is one of the acronyms I've developed. It explains people leaving Melbourne in particular to go to lifestyle towns beyond the edge of the metropolitan area, you know, like Daylesford and Castlemaine and so forth. I call them Vespas, V-E-S-P-A, virus escapees seeking provincial Australia. So these Vespas have been scootering out of our capital cities. I'm not sure that there is that Vespa movement in the West, and if there was, they'd be scootering up the coast and down the coast, is my view. So watch out for the Vespas, in fact, in Western Australia. Now, finally, I can't seem to go anywhere these days without talking about smashed avocado. And in fact, this is a reference to a column that I wrote 5 years ago. I have a column in the Weekend Australian magazine, and I wrote a column as a middle-aged baby boomer saying, you know, complaining about hipster cafes. It was all done as a parody on middle age. And I said, as a baby boomer in a hipster cafe, you can't read the menu because the writing is too small. You can't hear yourself speak because the music is too loud. You can't sit on a milk crate because that means your bottom is lower than your knees and you can't get back up again. And then I said, you whisper to each other, look at all these young people eating smashed avocado. Shouldn't they be saving for a house? It was all done as a parody on middle age. Of course, Twitter came along, took just that comment about young people, said, Bernard Salt said this about young people, what do you think about that? I saw that tweet go live at 6:27 a.m. on the Monday morning. By 10 a.m, I was fielding calls from the BBC in London. This thing went global, viral and feral absolutely immediately. It made the newspapers in Caracas, Venezuela. I was pretty impressed with all that. I particularly liked the memes around this. They surfaced within a day or two. Here is one of those memes. I stopped eating smashed avocado and now I own a castle. In fact, there's a whole series of them that I think was the best one. I think it's 5 years or so ago. Surely it's all died off. Not so. About a year ago, someone sent me anonymously sent me a photograph of a defaced or graffitied road sign 13 kilometres outside the Victorian township of Avoca, which would suggest that the Australians are never letting go of the avocado thing. This photograph has gone around the world, courtesy of the Australian newspaper. Smashed avocado, $13, which I think is quite cheap for smashed avocado. Someone else has suggested that just building on this menu theme, Ballarat could have been changed to Ballaratouille. I quite like that one as well. Yes, smashed avocado. I actually think that it should replace our national dish, lamb, as our national dish. And so have a smashed avo next Australia Day is my thinking. And with that, I will now encourage you all to reach to the centre of your table and open your brown paper bags, because West Australian Apartment Advocacy has spared no expense on this conference. They have put an avocado. I'm not sure what the average cost of an avocado is these days. I think it has decreased, but when you have that later, then please do think of me. Just finally, some key points. The point I want to get across, and it's not just about apartments. I've had this view for about 20 years or so, and that is that West Australians will extract the best of what the East has and then do it slightly differently. Do it in a local style, you know that, and I've seen it from the sea change, tree change thing, and I think you can see it again in the apartments. I think a lot of mistakes were made in the eastern seaboard with their apartment product. not perfect. So West Australians saying, yep, that's fine, that's great, but we have learnt from that, and here is what meets our requirements. And I think apartments now have a better appeal to the market, not just because of the demographic underpinnings and the tailwinds you can see in Western Australia. It's this idea of a Control-Alt-Delete moment. I'm rethinking my job, I'm rethinking where I want to live. People leaving Melbourne, they're going to Queensland or Western Australia if they could get in. And so Control-Alt-Delete moment in history, then people say, well, maybe I will sell up in suburbia and position my life, my job, my relationship perhaps, in a way that suits me for the 2020s. And then new markets emerging. I actually think that we will see almost like that Manhattan-esque. I mean, people raise kids in Manhattan Island, so I do think that there will be an element of that millennial generation who refuse to go to suburbia and will want 2, 3, even 4-bedroom apartments in the inner city. And also the idea, I know it's a little bit out there, but the idea of sort of late 70s, even 80s, living by themselves in an apartment, the safety, the security, and then sort of ordering in services, not like a hotel, not necessarily room service, but physio and medical and nursing, or whatever you need, you actually draw it in to you in that central location, and particularly where that central location is positioned within what I call the drop-in zone for family, friends, and particularly grandparents. And with that, I will pass it back to Sam to manage some Q&A. Thank you very much. Yep. Right. Pleasure. Well, thank you very much for that question. I do understand that it's not just in Western Australia, but right across Australia, the coastal frontages and the development, the densification, the height and so forth, these are very sensitive issues. And these are sensitive issues that must be managed by the local community with consultation with the town planners and so forth. I'm a demographer, so I'm going to pass the hard bit in terms of deciding what the density should be to those local communities. They should have local control over height limits and so forth. I will say though, as a Melburnian and a visitor to a number of sea change communities right across Australia, that I do find an articulated, activated road front to be very engaging. In fact, so having those nooks and crannies, the alleyways that Melbourne does particularly well, to have that places that you discover as you're at the beach, I think that would certainly be would be great to introduce. I do think that this is a great time in history to be bold and ambitious and to actually say, this is the way we've done things for the last 20, 30, 50 years or so, but I think we can do things better. I think we can create a better model for how our city works. Do you really think we should be commuting from Mandurah into the city centre? Or in fact, can we create these 20-minute cities? Can we create these apartment precincts that actually deliver a better quality of life, that strike the right balance between providing the opportunity for people to leave suburbia and leave that open to other generations to raise their kids there. So again, I think that we need to encourage people to think broadly and to get across this idea that we are indeed living through a Control-Alt-Delete moment, this great resignation, the great reset thinking that I think we need to go through. It's time for a new generation to come through, a new generation of planners, a new generation of developers to come through and to boldly reimagine the future. And I'm all for community consultation, but sometimes you do need that permission to think boldly. And what I'm saying is the pandemic is the permission to think boldly and ambitiously for your communities, whether they're on the coast or in the suburbs. Well, I do think that that the West is a long way away, that it's almost like Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, the eastern seaboard. It's linked by the Great Dividing Range, by the Princes Highway, the Pacific Highway, and there is a commonality. It's certainly from a demographic point of view. People leave New South Wales and they go into southeast Queensland. People come from Tasmania into Melbourne. There's almost a north-south thing happening in the demography of the eastern seaboard, driven by Melbourne and Sydney, which are extraordinarily global cities. There are figures that I've extracted from the last census that show that up to 75, even 80% of net new workers in Melbourne and Sydney actually come from overseas. So incredibly global communities and very north-south orientated. In fact, I also did an analysis once to see the source of immigrants to each state, and I came to the conclusion that Western Australia was more likely to get immigrants from the UK than from east of the Nullarbor Plain. So the Nullarbor Plain is really a significant, almost mental barrier within Australia. Now, that in times of COVID has been a terrific level of security to the West, but it is a very different community. Yes, the ethnicity stock might be the same, but the behaviour, the canvas of the city is different. it's positively Los Angelian in scale, from Yanchep in the north to south of Mandurah in the south. And it just feeds into my view that West Australians, yep, they're Australian, but they're also very, very proudly independent and very proud of their way of life. And this observation that the West Australians never bought into tree change the way Victorians, New South Wales, Queensland, and even South Australians did, with the Fleurieu Peninsula and so forth. The West Australians will do it our way, thank you very much, and shrug it off. And it's almost, what is it, 2.5, close to 3 million people or so. It's its own economy, its own values. It does not have to mimic the West, the East Coast. What it can do, what I think it does do, is, you cherry pick. I like this bit, I like that bit, I like that bit, and we will do it our way. And be very sort of proud of it. I think that is the essence of Western Australia and Perth. Well, I think we need to start the conversation, and I think the purpose of a West Australian apartment advocacy group fits the bill. It's got a lot of work ahead of us, but you need the conversation. You need buzz. You need to actually articulate the case. You need to deliver the narrative, and you need to reinforce the narrative. I've discovered this in terms of travelling around Australia speaking. You need to say things. You need to actually have a good narrative, have a good idea. It must be anchored in fact or an observable life experience, and then people will grab it, people will accommodate it and gravitate towards it. Yes, I get that financial institutions might be more traditional and conservative in their thinking, but I think that this is most certainly the way forward. I don't see it as mainstream. Daryl Kerrigan ain't ever going to live in an apartment. He was happy in his castle out in suburbia. But there is a significant cosmopolitan, aspirational group that does want that Manhattan-esque style of living. Prior to the pandemic, Australians were some of the most travelled, the most prosperous, the most cosmopolitan people on earth. In fact, and I think we'll go back to that way. We are obsessed with lifestyle, we're obsessed with housing. And, out of that comes the McMansion. I kind of get that. It's been around for 20 years and it's been tweaked and developed and improved and whatever. It's time to pivot and to provide that market with another option. And that option is the apartment option. The kind of product we saw with that Mossman Park product. Absolutely exactly what I am talking about. It's not a student apartment, but it hits that middle market or middle-aged market absolutely perfectly. And I think developing the narrative and discussing it, putting it out there, and decoupling it from the price point. It did not even occur to me when I was putting this presentation together. I'm so excited about finding a niche for every segment of the market that's aspirational, that meets their needs. I'm assuming that people will pay the price that it takes to deliver that product. And that's the logic that I'm working on. Then again, I'm not a developer, so probably just as well. I'd go broke. Thanks, Sam. Thank you. Clear?